1 year, one new virus, and the word that's going to dominate the way we live our lives.
This lockdown.
Lockdown.
As the UK reaches the first anniversary of the first national lockdown, with the fourth highest death toll per capita globally, we're asking whether the government could have, and maybe should have, done more to protect us. Or if hindsight really is 2020. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and for today's episode of Choppers Politics, I sat down with our associate editor, Gordon Rayner. He's been taking a forensic deep dive into the events of the past year, talking to people inside and outside of government. That's cabinet ministers, advisors, and members of SAGE, about what was really going on behind the scenes. Now, there's likely to be an inquiry into the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, so Gordon's conversations could give us a hint of what the people in the room are going to say and where the blame might lie. Gordon's been reporting all week on the result of those conversations. And earlier, I asked him to come on this podcast and tell me what he had found out, and he said that something kept coming up time and time again.
One of the most striking things from the conversations I was having was the extent to which people in government and in Downing Street are now prepared to accept that we should have locked down sooner. I'm talking particularly about the first lockdown because that's, it's the anniversary coming up. That was March the 23rd last year we went into lockdown. What I found out was that there was a key meeting on the 14th of March last year when a chap called Ben Warner, who is a data analyst working in Downing Street, did some number crunching and discovered that all of the predictions and projections that Boris Johnson was being given through government departments using numbers compiled by SAGE and the NHS, those predictions turned out to be wrong. And his numbers showed that the NHS was going to be overwhelmed within about 3 weeks of that point. Now, what's interesting about that is that was on the 14th of March. Boris Johnson took another 9 days to put the country into lockdown. And that's the period that I think people are most concerned about when you talk to them now, that they feel that really they maybe should have gone into lockdown straight away. They didn't trust the public perhaps to be able to cope with it straight away.
We need people to start working from home where they possibly can. Avoid pubs, clubs, theatres and other such social venues.
So we had this slightly bizarre period that you'll remember when people were being told don't go to the pub, but the pubs were still open, and people were being told don't go to work, but you can go to work. And so it was very confusing. And people have said to me that really that was a crazy period, that it didn't make any sense at all. And as I say, I think when we come to an inquiry, maybe the Prime Minister himself will say, really, I wish we'd done lockdown straight away when I got that information.
And in terms of preparation for a pandemic, there was this Operation Cygnus that was carried out, wasn't there, a few years ago, but that was the wrong type of flu.
That's right. So in 2016, as was reported at the time, the government carried out a pandemic planning exercise called Exercise Cygnus. It was called that because Cygnus for swan, and they were operating on a pretend type of flu that they called swan flu, although one minister said to me that it also was quite appropriate because it was a black swan event, an event that you don't see coming. The problem was that everything in the pandemic planning was based on the idea that the threat from abroad was going to be a flu pandemic. Now, that was probably the most likely threat, but it was done to the exclusion of all else. We'd had SARS, we'd had MERS in the Far East, but for some reason which nobody's really been able to quite satisfactorily explain, nobody really gave much credence to the idea that these respiratory illnesses, which had emerged in the Far East before, in the Middle East, could end up coming to this country, even though, as we know, we live in a very, very connected world. And if an illness breaks out in one part of the world, there's every possibility it's going to break out in another. But the consequence of that was that we had ministers and civil servants who were overconfident, people have said to me, in their ability to handle the pandemic when it did come around. They felt that they'd planned for it. They had a manual that they could follow that told them what to do, that it was all going to be sorted out. This obviously also came at a time when you had a new government or a newly re-elected government that suddenly had this majority of 80, You had Brexit happening on the 31st of January that year. You had the budget happening on March the 11th. They were very caught up in wanting to use that mandate to carry out manifesto pledges and levelling up, all of those things. And I think a lot of people in government now accept that maybe they were a bit distracted by the sort of politics that was going on at the time. And what didn't help was having a civil service, it is alleged, who were saying to the government, well, don't worry, you can get on with the politics. We know how to handle this pandemic stuff. We've been through this planning exercise, but they planned for the wrong thing.
Well, we're guided by the science and everything that we do.
And they hid behind the science, didn't they? They followed the science, and that meant not stopping mass gatherings, leaving the borders open.
Yeah, so and another theme which came up many, many times in conversations I was having was that there was a problem with the policy of following the science, in as much as, sure, it's difficult not to say you're going to follow the science, because the opposite of that is to say, well, we're not going to follow the science. So clearly you have to follow the science to a certain degree. But there are decisions that politicians and leaders can take without necessarily having to be slavish to the science. The problem with science is that it takes a long time. Scientists need to gather data, they need to analyse it, they need to talk about it, and that takes a long period of time. People have said to me that there were no-brainers that they should have just acted on straight away. It was a no-brainer that we were going to end up wearing face masks. But obviously, as everyone will remember, there was this enormously long period of...
It took weeks.
All this ponderousness about, do they have an effect? Are they effective? We're not sure. We all ended up doing it. It was obvious from the start we were going to end up doing it. And that was a very good example.
I think by then, Gordon, on masks, on that narrow point, they didn't even say that they actually would stop the disease. They thought they may have a bearing, but no one's quite sure.
I mean, there's still debate going on now about the effectiveness or otherwise of face masks. But the point was, it was blindingly obvious that at some point they were going to end up telling people you should wear a mask, because if nothing else, it was reassuring to people. But they dithered and dithered. And there were other very sort of clear-cut examples of where they followed the science to beyond the point where they needed to. So Cheltenham Festival is happening this week. Last year, everyone will remember, of course, Cheltenham was allowed to go ahead. There were lots of questions at the time about, is this really the right thing to do? We had press conferences where ministers were being asked, should we really be letting this event where 250,000 people turn up over the course of 4 days? Should that really be going ahead? There was the Liverpool Atletico Madrid match, which obviously you will remember as a Liverpool fan.
We lost.
Yes, lots of questions about whether those things should go ahead. And the problem was that the scientists were saying, well, we don't have any evidence that you're going to increase the spread of transmission by allowing these things to go ahead. Part of the logic that they were putting forward was, well, if we stopped these events happening, people would go and watch them in the pub and they'd be in close confinement. It would be even worse.
Yeah.
Nobody said, well, maybe we should close the pubs, because it was unthinkable at that point. Also, nobody seemed to have made the point to them that, well, if you have a football match that goes ahead, people will go to the pub before the match and then they'll go to the pub after the match anyway. But the point being that by being slavish in following the science, I think there's an acceptance that leaders, including Boris Johnson, were at times sort of abrogating their responsibility, that they should have led rather than followed, and that you don't always have to wait for scientists to make their mind up when something is very obviously the right thing to do.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
There's growing anger over how coronavirus has taken hold in care homes across the UK. The government suggests that 1 in 4 of the overall...
You haven't even mentioned care homes yet, and the fact that people who could have been affected were allowed to leave hospital to clear beds for ventilated beds and go straight into care homes.
Yes, I think we'll see an awful lot of buck passing when it comes to the question over care homes when there is an inquiry into all this. Obviously, the facts are that Britain has had between about a quarter and a third of all deaths from COVID have been in care homes, which is a far worse proportion than many similar countries in Europe. Some countries are worse, but countries like Germany have done much better. And the countries that have done better were the ones that, for example, took precautions of quarantining people when they were leaving hospital and going into care homes. The excuses that people have been making to me over care homes have ranged from, well, we didn't have the testing capacity, so there was nothing we could do about it, to, it wasn't really releasing people from hospitals into care homes that spread it. It was all the staff coming in and going between care homes. Well, none of those excuses really holds much water because, for a start, Germany didn't have many tests either, but they decided that they would quarantine people because it seemed like a sensible precaution at a point where asymptomatic transmission was not necessarily fully understood, but was recognised as being a possibility, and they had a lot of success with that. Also, the suggestion that, it's all the staff's fault because the care homes were employing agency staff who work in more than one care home. Well, that's a sort of a problem with the fact that successive governments have not sorted out the problem with care homes. We know that Boris Johnson and Theresa May before him said they were going to sort out the crisis in social care once and for all. They still haven't done it. We had another budget recently where they didn't mention social care at all. So the difficulty for them is that the reason that care homes were employing agency staff who were going between homes was that there is a lack of money in the social care sector. Now, there's a whole other debate to be had about how you solve care home funding, but to suggest that they somehow didn't realise that was going to be a thing seems a little bit disingenuous.
We're expecting the action on social care by the end of this year, by the way, listeners, in case you're waiting for that, so don't hold your breath.
Which is what they said last year and the year before.
Are these things that we can only see easily in hindsight, do you think, Gordon Rayner, or do you think the government could and should have done more at the time?
Hindsight is a wonderful thing. I think, as we've said in the articles that we've been running over this week, you have to try and see everything through the prism of what was known at the time. And there are things that weren't known at the time, which they would have made different decisions had they known what they know now. But there are things which they could have done differently with the knowledge they had then. As I say, I think there is an acceptance that, for example, with lockdown, that they could have gone sooner on that, even on the knowledge that they had at that point. I think borders is another good example of how they could have done things differently with the knowledge that they had. I mean, in fairness, the Telegraph, I think, in common with a lot of other media organisations, was in favour of keeping borders open. And I think that it was right that we didn't completely isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. But there were voices in cabinet who were suggesting that maybe they should have done more with borders earlier than they did. And interestingly, one member of SAGE that I spoke to told me that the whole scientific community has to look at itself and try to answer the question of why they seem to accept from the get-go that there was no way of stopping COVID coming to this country. There was a slight sort of shrug of the shoulders, I think, that it was going to end up coming here. Once it was here, there wasn't much you could do about it. So there's no point in closing the borders. Well, if you contrast it with the most stark example of a country that went the other way, if you look at, say, New Zealand, to date, they have had 26 deaths from COVID. If you look at Australia, which is a country which, of course, it's not the same country as Britain. It's a huge country. It has a smaller population. They've had 909 deaths in the entire pandemic.
What was your reaction when you heard there were no active cases of COVID-19 remaining in New Zealand?
I did a little dance.
Now, obviously, there are lots of arguments why we couldn't necessarily have done what they did. We rely far more on imports than those countries do. We're not as self-sufficient. We're not the same country in terms of geography and demographics. But certainly there are lots of questions within government about could more have been done with borders. One senior person said to me that they wish that they had done temperature testing at airports, for example, which, as you'll remember, there were lots and lots of arguments going on a year ago about why are we not doing testing at airports? Why are we not temperature checking people like other countries are doing? And the argument was, well, it doesn't do much good. It misses out people who are asymptomatic. Well, it does, but I think there are now people who are looking back on that and saying, well, even if we had missed 40% of people coming into the country with COVID, if we'd caught 60% of the people coming into the country, then we might have saved quite a lot of lives that way. And even just purely from a sort of presentational point of view, I think there are people who wish that they had just done it anyway, because it was difficult to argue against doing it. And even if they'd done it and didn't feel it was going to make that much difference, they could have saved themselves an awful lot of arguing, and they expended a lot of political capital in not doing it. And that was political capital which really they needed at a time when there were so many arguments raging about the rights and wrongs. And just one final point on borders. As one person said to me, again, they were relying on or following the science on borders. Sage was telling the government there's not a lot of point in doing these border checks. They won't do much good. And you would have to stop 95% of the COVID entries into the country in order to buy a month. Well, the point about that is that, as one person said to me, sometimes scientists talk in sort of very binary terms, that if something isn't 100% successful, there's no point in doing it. I think politicians would probably look at that, and if they were honest, would say, well, if we could have stopped 95% of infections, or if we could have bought a month by doing that, then maybe that would have been useful and not a complete failure. So I don't think we're in a position to judge necessarily whether people made terrible mistakes. I think it's as Boris Johnson has said, when we come to an inquiry, it should be a lessons learned exercise and a way of making sure we don't get into this situation again, rather than necessarily a blame game and a who needs to have the finger pointed, who needs to be sacked.
And Gordon Rayner, all of these issues about not controlling the virus came back to bite the very people in number 10 Downing Street, didn't they?
They did. As people will recall, there was an outbreak of coronavirus in Downing Street, and famously the Prime Minister himself not only caught coronavirus, but as we all know, ended up in hospital, ended up on life support, and had a brush with death, really. There's no two ways about it. There are some fascinating accounts from people who were there in Downing Street at the time that was happening. The St Thomas's Hospital called Downing Street on the evening of Sunday, April the 5th, I believe it was.
Yeah, I was working.
It was a Sunday night anyway. He went into hospital. The hospital rang Downing Street, and they said, we're going to have to take him into intensive care. And they told the Downing Street staff that there was a 50-50 chance they would have to intubate the Prime Minister, and that the odds at that point, if you had to be intubated, were pretty poor. Anything between a 20% chance of survival and a 50% chance of survival, depending on which hospital you were at. So obviously that was a hugely shocking moment for the staff. They talked to me about going to bed that night, not knowing whether they were going to wake up the next morning to be told that he'd died. And, it really was an extraordinary moment in our history, probably the closest we've come to losing a Prime Minister in office since the mid-Victorian period. A really terrible time. I think he came back to work, obviously, as we know, that people are admitting now that he came back to work probably a week earlier than he should have done. We knew a lot of that stuff, but what's interesting now is that people are starting to admit that while he was in hospital, Downing Street wasn't necessarily the nest of singing birds that, as Boris Johnson likes to say. There were some tensions in Downing Street. There were ministers who were trying to muscle in on Dominic Raab's role as the stand-in Prime Minister. As one person said to me, there were a couple of senior ministers who were auditioning to be Prime Minister. This is, again, these are things which I would imagine will be perhaps aired at a future public inquiry. I should say that after a couple of days of the Prime Minister being in hospital, I think things started to calm down a lot. Dominic Raab has had a lot of praise from people for the way that he handled the situation, that he was very sort of calm, didn't really try and become the Prime Minister, just kept the ship, on a steady heading. But that there was definitely some bad behaviour going on among cabinet ministers.
You looked at the evidence, you spent 4 weeks or 5 weeks doing it. You're uncorking yourself into the world this week with what you found out. To what extent do you think that what you've learned will be a problem politically for the government? Do you think that the fact we're quite an obese nation, that had a bearing on numbers of deaths? Or will it be decisions made by the government led to deaths, and there will be a reckoning on that before the election?
Well, unquestionably, as you say, I mean, things like obesity have been a huge problem, but that's been a problem for as long as most of us can remember. I think the problem is going to be that at the moment, the government has a vaccine bounce. We haven't discussed the vaccine. That's because I've been concentrating on the aspects of what happened a year ago. We will be covering the success of the vaccine in the magazine on Saturday, so we haven't forgotten that. And clearly the government is doing very well in the polls at the moment, because quite rightly people are giving them huge credit for the success of the vaccine programme, and that was a gamble for the government, to spend huge amounts of money on something that may not work. They've done very, very well with that. But I think the problem for them when we do come to an inquiry is that once that sort of vaccine bounce has subsided a little bit, if we end up in a situation where there is a lot of score settling to be done, which I think is possible, that if people are put in front of a retired judge or civil servant in, live on telly and have a lot of pressure put on them, then they may start blaming other people and saying, well, this wasn't my fault, this wasn't my decision, this was somebody else. And once you get into that situation, then I think you could be airing a lot of dirty linen in public. And I think that could be a problem politically, because that will come after the vaccine program has sort of, worked its way through. And I think probably the sooner the government gets an inquiry done and dusted, the better, because they certainly don't want an inquiry to be dragging on for a year or something and going into the next election cycle. I think if I were Boris Johnson, I'd want to get this inquiry done soon, get it over with quickly, and then be able to move on with several years before the next election, so that it becomes a distant memory.
Just on the issue of the public inquiry, do you think that what you've learned, or the blame game that you're laying out in the Telegraph all this week, that it might end up with a battle of lawyers and everyone starts tooling up for a litigation fest of who's to blame and why these deaths were required? It could get very, very nasty, couldn't it?
Well, as we know, this country in recent years has become a much more litigious country. We are inevitably sort of heading in the same direction as America, that people think that they have to sue people for everything. The potential for litigation, obviously, is absolutely vast. You've got 125,000 plus people who have died. You have got questions over how many of those deaths could have been avoided. Obviously, we don't know what the terms of reference for any inquiry will be, but if you get to the level where people have a right to talk about individual deaths, then it could go on for years, potentially. I mean, we've had a situation that has already played out over the course of a year. The scope for a public inquiry that drags on for almost forever is very high. We've seen from past experience with things like the Iraq inquiry just how long these things can go on for when you start playing out decisions and meetings in second-by-second detail. And we've also seen how long it can take for chairmen of these inquiries to report back. You remember the Chilcot inquiry, it took literally years because everybody had to be given a right to reply. So, yeah, I mean, this is something, as we said, there is a danger that this could drag on and on and on and still be dragging on at the time of the next election, which is something which I'm sure Boris Johnson would be desperate to avoid.
And just finally, Gordon Rayner, you spent your time looking at the approach to the pandemic. Has your faith in government been shaken? Do you think this government or any government will be able to react differently when or if the next pandemic comes?
I think what it's probably confirmed for somebody who has spent a while covering politics is that we sometimes think that the people that we elect to run the country and people who are civil servants who are in the country know exactly what they're doing at all times. And the truth is they don't always have all the answers. Sometimes they struggle. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing. And they're only human. They make mistakes the same as the rest of us. I think we already knew that, but it's abundantly clear from talking to people who were in the thick of this that there were lots of things that they struggled with, and people are honest enough to admit that. I think if we want to take the positives from it, I do think that there will be an enormous amount of lessons learned from this. I think that you can see already that were this to happen again, we would be better prepared. For example, if you take the whole PPE fiasco, everybody remembers the shortage of PPE. Part of the reason for that was that we hardly made any PPE in this country, so we're having to try and find it from abroad, and everybody else was scrambling for the same stuff. I think we now make 70% of PPE that the NHS uses in this country, which means that we're unlikely to have that problem again if we have a similar problem occurring. I think we've now set up the test and trace system, which I think could be very quickly called back into action if it was needed again. We didn't have that at all last time. I think we have now got vaccine manufacturing in this country on a scale that we've never had before. So I do honestly think, even with my most cynical hat on, I do think that there have been a lot of things that the government has put in place which will stand us in good stead should we be confronted with another disease X, as they say in these planning exercises, or as perhaps they failed to do last time around. And yeah, so I do think that, we've had some benefit of being able to prepare for whatever may be thrown at us in the future.
Well, Gordon Rayner, our associate editor, formerly our political editor, who has spent weeks looking at what went wrong or what went right with the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics.
Lovely to be here, Chris.
Gordon Rayner there, and you can find links to his brilliant reporting on a truly unforgettable year in the episode description to this podcast. It's really worth your time, and if you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you, dear listener, can get your first month completely free of all of our best content. Journalism like this takes time, but we can't do it without our subscribers. And while lockdown carries on, if you have a spare 5 minutes and fancy the chance of winning one of 3 £100 John Lewis vouchers, we're running a survey to learn a little bit more about what makes you like our podcast and what else you'd like to hear from us. There's a link also to that in the show notes to this episode. Please rate, review and subscribe on your podcast app. And if you want to get in touch, we're at Choppers Politics at telegraph.co.uk or on Twitter at Choppers Podcast. Thank you to my guest today, the Telegraph's Associate Editor, Gordon Rayner. Thanks as ever to my brilliant team of producers, Theo Luludis, Louisa Wells and Elliot Lampitt. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. And if you can, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time then, cheerio!